Hello and welcome everybody. I'm Anthony Gonzalez and I'm the program coordinator for the Higher Education Center for Alcohol and Drug Misuse Prevention and Recovery. Excuse me. And we want to welcome you all today to our webinar titled Understanding Passion for Substance Use Among College Students with and Without a Cannabis Use Disorder, featuring Yitong Xin. Before we get started with today's session, I do just have a couple of housekeeping slides I'd like to review with everybody. Here on this slide should look somewhat familiar as we are in the Zoom webinar format. We do welcome your questions at any time throughout the live session for our presenter, but we will be holding them till the very end. We do kindly ask that you utilize the Q&A feature for your questions. We do have the chat enabled. We ask that you utilize the chat to share who you are, where you're joining us from, any resources and reflections as it relates to today's content. But again, if you have specific questions for our presenter, please utilize the Q&A feature just so we don't lose track of them. Additionally, we have live captioning enabled for today's session. If you have any trouble getting that set up, please just send me a message and I will try my best to help you through getting that set up. We also encourage everybody to learn more about becoming a member of the Higher Education Center. You can learn more about the different membership tiers and the benefits that go along with them by visiting our website at hecaod.osu.edu. I'm also excited to announce a few upcoming events we have. We have our February water cooler chat taking place on the 13th, and we'll be focusing on trauma-informed care. Additionally, later in February, we have a free webinar titled Moving Beyond Orientation, Increasing Engagement of Parents and Families as Partners in Reducing Substance Use Among College Students. And that will be taking place February 28th. We also have the 2024 national meeting taking place at the end of July and the beginning of August here in Columbus, Ohio. We'll also have a simultaneous virtual offering going on. Additionally, we have the call for proposals open, and if you have interest in our session proposals that you would like to submit, we do ask that you submit them by the end of the day, Friday. And with that, it is my great pleasure to turn it over to our presenter today, Yitong Xin, PhD candidate, graduate research and teaching associate with the Center for Psychedelic Research and Education, housed in the College of Social Work at The Ohio State University. Thank you for joining us, and it is my pleasure turning it over to you at this time.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. My name is Yitong. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay. Is everybody able to see my slides?
Looks great.
Okay, let's, Anthony already introduced the center, and I will jump into our presentation. Hello, everyone. My name is Yitong Xin. I'm a PhD candidate at Ohio State University. So I'm excited to share our research findings with you about the relationship between passion and substance use among college students. For those students who have cannabis use disorder and who have not met the inclusion criteria for cannabis use disorder. So the title for today's talk is Understanding Passion for Substance Use Among College Students with and Without a Cannabis Use Disorder. So before we jump into the content, I want to acknowledge my co-authors and team members on the Passion Study project. They are Dr. Alan Davis, Dr. Brooke Atterbury, Dr. Erin Bonner, Dr. Stacy Armstrong, and Ms. Corinne Schuwarting and Ms. Sterling Harvard, as well as the funding source. The work was supported by a seed grant from the College of Social Work at The Ohio State University and a seed grant from Iowa State University College of Liberal Arts. The funding source has no role in the study, data analysis, interpretation, or communication of findings. Okay, so for today's webinar, I will follow this presentation structure, starting with the study background and followed by passion for substance use and some introduction of our passion study project. Also, I will talk about the relationship between passion and substance use, the impact of public health crises, such as the COVID-19 pandemic on cannabis use and emotional well-being, and how the study implication for substance use intervention and prevention. And definitely we will have some time for the final Q&A. Okay, so let's look at the background section together. So people may ask you, why should we pay attention to substance use among college students? Why are alcohol use and cannabis use actually a significant concern among this population? Why should we designing and implementing more effective interventions for this population? So before answering these questions, I want to invite you to look at some most updated data from the national surveys, which just published a few months ago, highlighting the severity of alcohol use and cannabis use among college students. So according to the Monitoring the Future panel study annual report, which summarizing the data from 1976 to 2022, which was published a few months ago in 2023, alcohol is by far the most widely used addictive substance among full-time young adults. So when I say full-time college young adults, I mean those people who are ages 19 to 22, who are enrolled in a 2 or 4 year college or university. If we look at the alcohol use in 2022, we can see almost 81% of college students reported alcohol use in the past 12 months, and over 60% reported drinking in the past 30 days. So this is for alcohol. Let's look at the cannabis. So for cannabis, which is another one of the most frequently consumed substance among college students, according to data in 2022, we have about 41% of college students reported cannabis use in the past 12 months, and 22% reported use in the past 30 days. And one thing I do want to point out, based on the data published in the Monitoring the Future survey in 2022, the survey monitor revealed a dramatic increase in vaping cannabis among college students since 2017 to 2022. The rate almost tripled from 4% to 11%. So that actually also highlighting the severity of cannabis use among this population. So we talk about alcohol use and also cannabis use. I want to emphasize another population who use cannabis and alcohol simultaneously, which we call them co-use, which refers to use cannabis and alcohol simultaneously. The co-use is also a growing public health concern. If we think about data published in the past 20 years from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, it's actually people who reported simultaneous use for alcohol and cannabis has increased significantly in the past 10 years. If we compare the simultaneous co-use and the concurrent use, so concurrent use actually refers to use of 2 or more substances during a given period of time, but it's not necessarily at the same time, exactly same moment, but simultaneously they emphasize the same moment. So that is the difference. According to data, the simultaneous co-use rate is actually almost twice as high as concurrent use among college students. Why should we concern about co-use population? According to data and research evidence, college students who engage in alcohol and cannabis simultaneously co-use behaviors actually reported greater frequency and quantity of substance use. They also reported more negative social and behavior consequences. For example, driving when they're impaired, having greater risk of having comorbid substance use and mental disorders when compared to their peers. The peers who don't use drug, or maybe the peers who only use one substance, such as alcohol only, or maybe cannabis only. So now we talk about the prevalence of alcohol use and cannabis use among college students. what's the prevalence of cannabis use disorder among this population? So before we jump into the prevalence of cannabis use disorder, I want to first introduce what is the criteria for cannabis use disorder clarified in the DSM-5. So cannabis use disorder refers to a problematic pattern of cannabis use, which causes clinical significant impairment or distress. If the people reported at least 2 of the following symptoms, so in DSM-5, there are 11 items, 11 symptoms. If they have at least 2 of them, they will meet the criteria for cannabis use disorder. There are actually a difference in severity of cannabis use disorder, which is mild, moderate, and severe. If people reported 2 or 3 symptoms, they will be identified, or they will be diagnosed with mild cannabis use disorder. If they have 4 to 5 symptoms, they will be moderate cannabis use disorder. If they have more than 6 and more, they will be severe cannabis use disorder. So now we know what is cannabis use disorder. What is the prevalence of cannabis use disorder among college students? So the prevalence of college students for CUD, according to the data, the lifetime prevalence of CUD, which is the cannabis use disorder, is about 9%. For those who report past year consumption of cannabis, the lifetime CUD prevalence rises to 25%. So why should we concern about that? One big reason is the impact of the expanded legalization of cannabis for recreational and medical purpose. So in order to provide more effective treatment for this population, treatment and intervention for cannabis use have to adapt to the changing situations, which should include the diversity in reasons of cannabis use, such as why students will use cannabis. Also, we need to address the potential for increased accessibility and normalization for treatment. Also, the developing more tailored approaches that will consider all different varied effects of cannabis on population. For example, incorporate an understanding of passion in substance use pattern and how passion will affect use behaviors and treatment outcomes. So that is actually a foundation for our next topic. What is passion and how it applies to human behaviors? So passion, let's begin by understanding the concept of passion. So passion, the word, when we talk about passion in human behaviors, it refers to the dualistic model of passion, which was developed by Dr. Vallerand at 2003, which is a conceptual model about understanding someone's relationship with an activity. So under this passion model, there are 2 passions. The first one is called harmonious passion. Sometimes we call that HP, and also obsessive passion. We call that OP. So in the passion model, the passion model actually suggested if the individual are more likely to, if they invest more time and energy to engage with an activity, they will develop passion for it. The passion model was initially applied to behaviors such as gaming, gambling, and pornography. In the past 10 years, researchers started to use passion model to understand substance use behaviors and treatment outcomes. So what is harmonious passion or the obsessive passion? So harmonious passion actually refers to a relationship with an activity that enhance and is well integrated in one's life. Just like the picture shown here, we can see all the stones, they are well balanced. And for obsessive passion, which actually refers to a relationship with an activity that's become so compelling and it causes conflicts with other activities and create dissonance between the activity and someone's values, just like the picture show is unbalanced. So now we have basic concept in mind. Let's look deeper and explore how the passion model actually apply to the substance use. Okay, so when applied to substance use, harmonious passion actually refers to the relationship with substance use that actually enhance and is well integrated in the person's life. And obsessive passion, when we use that to understand substance use, it refers to a relationship with substance use that becomes so compelling. They are so compelled and attracted to use the substance and causes conflict with with other activities and one's values. So we know what is the concept of passion, and we also talked about how the category under the passion model. I want to share some existing research evidence on substance use, which show different association between passion and substance use related consequences. So let's look at the cannabis use first. So according to papers published in 2015, 2017, and 2018, the research evidence actually showed that a greater obsessive passion was typically associated with greater cannabis use and more consequences. And greater harmonious passion was typically associated with greater cannabis use and fewer consequences. So in conclusion, for cannabis use, it seems that no matter the harmonious passion or maybe obsessive passion, they both associated with greater cannabis use. The difference is harmonious passion actually have fewer consequences, but obsessive passion actually associated with more consequences. That is for cannabis use. So let's look at alcohol use. According to the data published in 2015 and 2019, so one of the clinical trial published from the data showing there is a significant positive relationship between obsessive passion and binge drinking and use-related consequences. And there is no relationship, there's no association between harmonious passion, between binge drinking or alcohol use outcomes. So that is data from one clinical trial. Another paper focusing on alcohol use gave a different conclusion. Their data actually showed harmonious passion was a stronger predictor of alcohol use compared to obsessive passion, where obsessive passion was a stronger predictor of alcohol use related to related problems than harmonious passion among heavy drinking college students. People may questioning why the conclusions are opposite. They are inconsistent with each other. I do want to point out for research studies, sometimes there are a lot of factors will influence the findings, such as the sample, because the study was conducted in different college setting. The student population is different. The school setting is different. For example, public school, private school, right? And also the age, the religion, the region, everything could be different. We can see the clinical trial, they focus on binge drinking. And the second study, they're just like heavy drinking. So it's kind of a little bit different. So that is could be one reason for the inconsistent findings. Okay, so now we know basic understanding for some existing research evidence on cannabis use and alcohol use. Why should we still conduct a passion study on substance use since we already have existing research evidence? Even these studies have shown a robust correlation of substance use and passion. These studies have a common limitation. They all have cross-sectional study design. So what is cross-sectional study design? Cross-sectional design actually is one type of observational study design that involves data analysis collected from one specific point in time. So in other words, you can understand the cross-sectional study design as a snapshot of the population at that moment. They are often used to evaluate and examine the prevalence of an outcome, or maybe used to examine the association between variables at the point in time, which actually limit our understanding of the predictive validity of the passion on substance use. So because we know the knowledge gap. So that is why we designed our passion study, which is a longitudinal prospective cohort study. So when I say longitudinal study, which means they have multiple time points, we collected data at multiple time points. For example, for this study, we collected data from baseline 5 months follow-up and 10 months follow-up. The longitudinal study design actually gave us stronger evidence of the causal relationship compared to the cross-sectional studies. It can also help us to identify early indicators or maybe predictors of later outcomes. For our passion study, we want to explore the substance use behaviors among undergraduate students from two United States Midwestern institutions, which they are Ohio State University and Iowa State University. So the study aims for this study, the aim one, we want to evaluate the passion model as a predictor for future substance use-related consequences and symptoms. And aim two, we want to examine the incremental validity of the passion model when included in a model using established constructs such as motives, coping motive for substance use, and substance use refusal, self-efficacy, and cannabis use symptoms as predictors for future cannabis use and related consequences. There are a lot of research terms. So in conclusion, in summary, or maybe in other words, to understand the aims, aim one is understanding the direct predictive ability of passion on the substance use. And aim two is about understanding the added value of passion when combined with other established predictors to understand substance use behaviors and outcomes. So now we know the aims. Let's look at our methodology. So for our passion study, the inclusion criteria are students need to be at least 18 years old because the nature of this study is about substance use. They also need to be able to read, write, and speak English fluently because everything was designed in English. They must be a student either at Ohio State or maybe at Iowa State. They reported used the cannabis at least 4 times in the past months. So we use 4 times as kind of like cut off or maybe threshold, because this number, according to a lot of evidence, is kind of like refer to the more risk population for substance use, maybe give us a more strong outcomes and evidence. So actually, when we design the study, we aim to recruit 50% of participants who reported at least 2 DSM-5 cannabis use disorder symptoms, which means we want to recruit at least 50% of participants. They met the criteria for CUD, which is we call them CUD group. We also want to recruit the other 50% of participants who did not meet the criteria for CUD, which is the non-CUD group, in order for us to compare the data analysis and findings. But unfortunately, even we tried really, really hard, most of the participants who complete the screening survey, they met the criteria for CUD, which means we have much more students reporting more than 2 cannabis use disorder symptoms in the screening survey. So actually, it also highlights the severity of cannabis use among college students. So let's look at our data collection. So our data collection started in November 2020 and concluded in November 2021. Initially, we have the screening link emailed to about like 726 students, and we have 2,174 students completed the screening survey. We have 1,220 students, they met inclusion criteria, and we have 570 528, they enrolled in the study. We also have 513, they completed the baseline survey. And among these 513 students who complete the baseline survey, we have about 308 students are in the COD group and 205 in the non-COD. And at follow-up, we have 431 students completed 5 months and 434 students completed 10 months. So because our surveys are actually long, so we want to, we offered gift cards to students who complete the study to thank for their contribution to our study. So students who complete the baseline survey actually received a $25 gift card, and students who complete the 5 months receive another $25, and students who complete the 10 months received a $40 gift card. So the retention rate actually is 84% at 5 months and 84.6% at 10 months. One interesting is among these 513 students who complete the baseline survey, there are 340 participants. Among these 513 participants, they actually reported the simultaneous co-use of alcohol and cannabis. Okay, so that is the data. Because of time limitation, I will only briefly review some demographic information and only report primary findings. So let's just look at the baseline data, because that is we have the most participants, which show us a basic picture of the population. Who are the students, right? So the average age is about 21 years old. Standard deviation is about 2 to 3 years. The sample size is 513. We can see the biological sex is actually quite even. Even we have a little bit more students identify their biological sex as female, which is 55%. And for race, we have most of the students, I would say almost like 80% of them identify as non-Hispanic white, which makes sense, right? Considering the school race distribution in Ohio State and Iowa State, we do have more white students in these 2 universities. For sexual orientation, we have 72.3% identify their sexual orientation as heterosexual, and then almost 90% of them reported full-time. We definitely have students reported part-time, or maybe when they complete the survey, they're in either spring break or fall break or on holiday. So we have one thing is really interesting is the GPA is actually quite impressive. We have over 80% of students reported their GPA greater than 3.0. And for the study side, it's quite even. We have 53.6% from Ohio State and 46.4% from Iowa State. Like I mentioned, we had a difficulty to have 50% for COD and 50% for non-COD. We have, so in the final sample, we have 60% students who have at least 2 DSM-5 COD symptoms, which means they met the criteria for COD. So they belong into the COD group. So now we have the background in mind. Let's explore how the passion model applies to substance use. So the first manuscript published from our passion study, we examined how the passion model for cannabis use was prospectively associated with cannabis use and use-related outcomes. Also, we're interested to learn more about passion for cannabis use. Is that also associated with academic performance and their relationship, attachment, and also social connectedness among these populations? So we also examine if the passion model will be associated with outcome when we put that together in a model using established predictors, like I introduced before, the AIM2, such as a coping motive, the refusal, self-efficacy, the cannabis use disorder symptoms as a predictor. So let's look at the research findings. So in this first manuscript, our research findings actually revealed that harmonious passion was not associated with cannabis use overall, or maybe cannabis use related consequences reported at 5 months and 10 months. We also have the finding that greater obsessive passion was associated with greater past-month cannabis use and more cannabis-related outcomes. We also see obsessive passion actually associated with less social connection. And also, because we already know in prior existing literature review, coping motives is a predictor. So when we include in the passion in model with coping motives and other predictors, we see both obsessive passion and coping motives, they were associated with more cannabis use related problems. If we compare obsessive passion with coping motives, we also see obsessive passion was actually a stronger predictor compared to coping motives. Just a brief introduction. What is coping motive in case some people don't know that? So coping motives refers to the reasons or motivation for one individual to use a substance for them to cope with their anxiety, to cope with their stress as a coping strategy. And the refusal self-efficacy refers to participants' confidence in their ability to refuse when they are offered of either cannabis or alcohol in different situations. So I know there are a lot of terms, a lot of statistical language. So the key point to take away from the first manuscript is harmonious passion is not a predictor of future cannabis use. Obsessive passion is a predictor. And when we observe when we compare obsessive passion with coping motives, we see obsessive passion is actually a stronger predictor compared to coping motives for cannabis use related problems. So that is the first paper focusing on cannabis use. Let's look at a passion for alcohol use. So in this paper, I specifically look into the co-use population. We have 513 students enrolled in the study and completed the baseline. And I mentioned a little bit early, among these 513 students, we have 340 students reported their simultaneous co-use of cannabis and alcohol. So I was interested to see how the passion and coping motives, are they going to predict alcohol use and alcohol use problems among this co-use population? So let's see what did we find from this paper. So in this paper, we use canonical correlation analysis to see how the coping motives and passion will be related to alcohol consequences and alcohol use disorder symptoms when we are controlling for their baseline cannabis use disorders. So which means like we put the COD students and non-COD students together, but we control their cannabis use disorder symptoms to see the overall sample. We also control the study site because we have students from 2 study locations. We also control the coping motive for cannabis use and passion for cannabis use because we want to look at specifically on alcohol use in this paper. So in our study finding, we have the study finding actually demonstrated the greater coping motives for alcohol use and greater harmonious passion for alcohol use, greater obsessive passion for alcohol use. They were significantly positively associated with more alcohol consequences and alcohol use disorder symptoms. So to remember that easily and the takeaway from this paper is actually harmonious passion, obsessive passion, and coping motives. They are predictors of alcohol use among this co-use population. I know some of you might be curious, like why did we control the COD symptoms? Why didn't we compare the COD group and the non-COD group? Actually, we did because I am interested. So I run the analysis separately for the COD group and the non-COD group specifically, because I want to say if this is consistent predictor for the COD group and non-COD group, and I can share with you the finding are consistent. So which means harmonious passion, obsessive passion, and coping motive, they are predictors for alcohol use among the students who are in the COD group, which means they reported more than 2 COD symptoms. There are also predictors for the non-COD group, which means they didn't have 2 symptoms. So we can see harmonious passion, obsessive passion, and coping motives. They are consistent for all the students as predictors for alcohol use. So now we talked a little bit about our publications regarding the relationship between passion and substance use. I do want to talk about the impacts of public health crisis. For example, the COVID-19 pandemic on substance use and mental health. So actually, initially, when we designed the passion study, it was before the pandemic. Nobody expected the pandemic would happen, so we didn't have a measure to see the changes for substance use and mental health. But then pandemic happened and the stay-at-home order was issued, and then we started to wondering, what are students' cannabis use and what their mental health would change when they are returning from school to their home and taking online classes. So because of that, we modified our study and resubmitted for IRB approval. We included a measure to evaluate the potential changes on substance use and mental health during the COVID-19 pandemic among these college students. We specifically, at that time, when we run this analysis, it's still in the mid of data collection because we want to see how the change will looks like among this cannabis use disorder group because they have more cannabis use symptoms. We thought it will be have a more obvious change among this group. So we only look at the cannabis use disorder group. So let's look at the findings. So when we look at the cannabis use change and mental health change during the COVID-19 pandemic among college students, specifically for the cannabis use disorder group, we observed a significant increase in cannabis use during the first phase of the pandemic when stay-at-home order occurred, which was correlated with a greater number of cannabis use disorder symptoms and cannabis use related consequences since the pandemic began. We also see a significant increase in negative emotions. For example, students reported they feel lonely, they feel stressed, they feel anxious, they feel depressed during the pandemic. And we also see one interesting is students who reported, we also see a greater frequency of cannabis use during the pandemic. And we see an association with greater frequency of using amphetamine type drugs and consumption of cannabis by dabbing since the pandemic began. This is something really interesting we observe from our study sample, which could be some future research areas for other researchers, like why it was correlated with more consumption for amphetamine and why was using cannabis by dabbing. But I do want to point out, even our study reported a significant increase in cannabis use among college students, which is consistent with most research studies. There are other research teams also reported increase in cannabis use because of during the pandemic. But there was one study, I found that it was really interesting and I want to share with you. There was one study published in 2022. In their study, they found out the cannabis use was decreased among their study sample, which is also college students. And the assumption the researcher given in their manuscript for the reasons to decrease cannabis use, they believe one reason is they think because students moved back to live with their parents, so which is a kind of like protective factor, also reduce their cannabis use. Another reason they mentioned is the difficulty to access the drug because everybody was staying at home. It's harder to make a deal with a drug dealer. So I thought this paper was really interesting, even it's inconsistent with all research findings. But I want to point it out here because sometimes the beautiful thing about research is we found different and inconsistent findings, but everything makes sense and it actually give us inspiration for future research and practice. So the takeaway for this paper is we did see an increase of cannabis use during COVID-19 pandemic. We also see the increase of negative emotions during COVID-19 pandemic. So this paper actually inspired us to think about when there is a public health crisis, how that is going to impact college students' substance use behaviors and mental health. Okay, so we talk about our paper and the two manuscripts, the three manuscripts from our passion study. What are some implications based on the existing research evidence and or passion study findings? How could we take it when we go to practice and when we go to research? What's the implication for research and practice? So let's talk about the implication for research and practice. So I would say for research, let's look at the research first. So the body of research I talk about today actually suggested the importance considering passion in substance use treatment, and in substance use prevention. Especially we want to consider why and to what extent young people, they will consume cannabis and alcohol, and how do they experience its use-related consequences. Future research should really consider incorporating the passion model, especially in some existing evidence interventions. We have a lot of treatment interventions, modalities when focusing on substance use treatment. How do we incorporate passion with these existing interventions? And one promising area actually we are suggesting is to consider adapting a brief motivational intervention to include the discussion of harmonious passion and obsessive passion, and also to assess if the harmonious passion and obsessive passion actually will increase or improve their cannabis use related outcomes among college students if we include that in the motivational interview. And one interesting area actually we point out in our study is we should consider exploring if someone's level of harmonious passion and obsessive passion is that going to differentially predict response to evidence-based treatment. For example, is that greater harmonious passion or maybe greater obsessive passion actually predict better or maybe worse treatment outcomes? That is something have not been examined, which could be something for future research directions, but it's something really interesting. So this kind of area actually highlighting the emphasis on passion could be beneficial in psychotherapy. Also, we suggest like future studies could also consider use harmonious passion and obsessive passion, the passion model as a screener at the beginning of the treatment to identify students who are more likely to need brief intervention, or maybe they actually need a referral for treatment. It could be a great screening tool. Of course, as I showed with you, the co-use population paper is always suggests us to monitor and address the co-use behaviors in treatment because as mentioned, co-use actually have more severe frequency and consequences. So that is something we should always monitor and address. So that is for research, and I want to talk about practice. Let's look at the practice. What can people take away, especially for clinicians in their practice from today's talk? So practice, I would say clinicians working with college students or maybe other young people who has substance use problems, they might want to consider if they want to integrate a discussion about passion, what is harmonious passion, what is obsessive passion, what is a passion model, and if they want to integrate a measurement of passion, so we have the passion model and the passion scale, which if you are interested, I'm happy to share. You can include the measurement of passion into your practice, into your counseling and treatment activities. Another suggesting for practice to use the language of passion is actually could help reduce stigma, which make it more accessible for college students because the stigma issue. Because a passion actually identify as a relational, have the relation with their life, with their substance use behaviors, which is compared to traditional intervention who always identify or label their cannabis use as problematic. It could definitely reduce stigma. And we will say the college students, just generally speaking, college students may be less likely to identify or maybe label their cannabis use as problematic because the frequency of use is really high. Instead, students maybe think about their cannabis use in terms of how it related to their life and experience. If we consider framing students' substance use by using the model of passion and understand that as a relational issue, we actually can encourage students to see their substance use in relation to their passion and daily life, which maybe encourage greater willingness among students to examine and potentially modify their substance use behaviors. Just like I mentioned, the one thing I think the passion model is really good for practice because the difference between the traditional treatment method, we emphasize their cannabis use or maybe alcohol use as behavioral issues, but now we frame them as passion, right? Okay, so reduce the stigma actually also could, which is also aligned with the recovery-oriented system of care model. So for those of you who are not familiar with the ROIC model, this is a model I really like. It's also aligned with the harm reduction approach because this model actually support that recovery is from any kind of substance use or disorder. We should consider the improvement in functioning, whether or not the improvement in functioning include reduction of substance use. If we see improvement in functioning, that is part of the recovery. Also, we believe the passion model has a great implication when we're considering the public health crisis. The study paper regarding the increase in cannabis use and negative emotions from this passion study also reminded us we should always adjust our treatment interventions when there is a public health crisis. How do we access students and encourage students into treatment? And how should we understand students' substance use behaviors and related outcomes? Same as a research part, we should always monitor and address the co-use behaviors because that is something give us more severe consequences. Okay, so in conclusion, for today's webinar, we actually explored what is the dualistic model of passion, the passion model, and how it applies to substance use. We also introduced the components of the passion model, which is a harmonious passion and obsessive passion. We also examined the relationship between passion and substance use from the prior existing research evidence, which they all have a cross-sectional research design, and also introduced OR study, which is a longitudinal study design. We also talk about the impact of public health crisis, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, how that will impact cannabis use and emotional well-being among these college students. We also discussed the implication for research and practice, especially for intervention and prevention strategies on substance use. So the conclusion here I want to share with you is as the landscape of cannabis use is evolving, especially with increasing legalization. It's really important to underscore the need for a paradigm shift in how we approach substance use counseling and treatment intervention for these unique populations. For example, we should consider use more updated approaches based on the research evidence. We always say evidence-based practice. So we should always consider using updated approaches based on the research evidence. We should also consider use a broader and more relatable framework. For example, the concept of passion maybe will improve the counseling effectiveness, but definitely there are also a lot of a consideration for future implication and how do we want to apply it, especially for research. The next step is if we want to further know about the passion in substance use, a more rigorous study design with a broader student population should be considered. Because our study, we recruited study samples from Ohio State and Iowa State. They are both public schools, and the majority are white students. So in the future, study should be considered to either collect data from private school or maybe Black school, and also use this model with diverse population, which could give us more diverse research findings and implication suggestions. Okay, thank you so much. I hope today's webinar has shared some useful information on the relationship of passion, substance use, and also provided you with some valuable perspective and useful tools to help you effectively navigate these changes. Thank you so much for your attention. I have listed my email address here, which is xin.93@osu.edu. If I didn't answer your question today because we only have limited time, feel free to email me and I will email you back for your answer. You can also scan the QR code here, which will leading you to my school page, also listed my email. Okay, so let's open the floor for any questions you might have.
Well, thank you so much, Yitong, for sharing of your research and of yourself today for our session. As they shared, now is the time for questions. So if you have questions for our presenter today, please utilize the Q&A feature. We did have a couple of questions come in throughout the presentation, so I can start diving into those. I believe this question came in while you were sharing the primary demographic characteristics from the first study, and they asked, for future studies, would you consider including other identities under the gender umbrella, such as individuals who are trans, non-binary, or gender fluid?
Yes, that's a really good question. Actually, we included that in our study design. It's just like it's now the primary funding. For this presentation, with the time limitation, I only sharing the primary funding. So if you go to the website and read our primary manuscript from this study, you will see we listed all these gender identities in the table 1, which shows you a basic picture of how the gender identity was considered in our study. Actually, we are also interested in the future direction. We haven't done that yet, but that is the next step to evaluate how the gender and sexual orientation actually will impact student substance use behaviors. We haven't run the analysis yet because there's so much data, but that would be the next step. So if you're really interested, please follow our study updates. And in the future, you'll see a manuscript talking about gender and sex and how that impact passion substance use. I hope I answer your question.
Great, thank you. We did receive a lot of interest in the passion scale. So, afterwards, if you are able to share that with me, I'll be sure to include that with today's session recording.
Of course.
We had another question. When considering the idea of adapting motivational interviewing skills to include harmonious passion and obsessive passion, could that better understanding these components aid in the evaluation around a student's readiness or willingness to change behaviors? Just for some insight or context, this individual commonly works with students in situations where they are being considered for amnesty in the student conduct process.
Yeah, I would say integrating the understanding of passion and also MI will definitely evaluating students' readiness and willingness to change. Actually, in our study, we have a skill measuring students' readiness to change. It's just like it's time limitation. I didn't share that today. But if you, again, I will refer you to read a manuscript because the manuscript actually included the details about how we evaluate students' readiness to change and how that actually changed from baseline to 5 months and 10 months when considering passion. But I agree with you, it's something really important. Like I mentioned, the coping motive, the self-refusal, and readiness to change. We always want to understand why students use cannabis and how will their behaviors change. And readiness and willingness to change is definitely something we need to keep that in mind. If maybe in the future, if we design a study, we could consider targeting the readiness or willingness to change as a primary variable. So it will give us more data, but definitely I will refer you to the manuscript. It gives us some data, not a lot, not like the passion, but it gives us a lot of useful information. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you. And I see that Logan put the manuscript in the chat. So thank you for doing that, Logan. And I believe this will be our last question. Would you be able to give an example of using language of passion to reduce stigma?
Yes, so what I'm going to do actually is I want to share my screen so you can see our manuscript and I can show you how the language was used in this manuscript. Okay, let me try to share my screen again. Because I feel like a lot of interest about the passion scale and also how did we use the language. Okay, here we go. So this is a paper I'm talking about. This is the primary paper. We definitely have another 2 papers I talk about today, and you can refer to the website. So this is a primary manuscript, including the scale, the passion scale. So I will show you here. What's the language we use for the, oh, by the way, this is a gender identity and sexual orientation for the first question. So the passion scale we use is called Harmonious Obsessive Passion Scale. So we actually modify this scale for 2 substances. One is specifically for cannabis. So we call that Harmonious Passion for cannabis and Obsessive Passion for cannabis. So for the cannabis specific passion scale, there are 13 items. So the question could be, there will be 1 to 6 from 0. The 5-point Likert scale will be 0, strongly disagree to the statement, and 4, completely agree. So some of the example statement could be, using cannabis allows me to live memorable experience. You say, we didn't say cannabis is a problem. We actually use the word memorable experience to make it more neutral. Or maybe another statement is, I have almost an obsessive feeling for using cannabis. We use the word obsessive as the scale suggested, and we use the word feeling it's really generally to talk about how they agree and disagree with each statement about their cannabis use. So similarly for alcohol, it will be same for alcohol, harmonious and obsessive passion scale. It's also 13 items. Will be same statement. The difference is focusing on alcohol use. So if you're interested to receive the full scale, you can email me, or maybe you can Google that. I'm sure you will find that online. I hope I answered your question.
Well, thank you so much, Yitong. It's always a pleasure for the opportunity to learn from you. And so thank you so much again for sharing of yourself and your research today. I do just have a couple of housekeeping slides I would like to share before we wrap up today. Again, we have our February webinar taking place on February 13th, which will be focusing on trauma-informed care. We also have a Fundamentals of Substance Misuse Prevention in Higher Education. That is a multi-session series starting at the beginning of February. Our next free webinar will be taking place at the end of February on the 28th and is titled Moving Beyond Orientation, Increasing Engagement of Parents and Families as Partners in Reducing Substance Use Among College Students. And of course, we have the 2020 2024 national meeting taking place at the end of July and the beginning of August. And the call for proposals is open, but will be closing this Friday. Thank you everybody for joining us. And just as a reminder, today's session has been recorded and you can expect to see it uploaded along with the session slides and mentioned resources within 3 business days. Thank you everybody and have a great rest of your day. Take care.